let me just share a little bit of my research and my kind of knitting together of the various information that I've found. So the China devalued the yuan. So what's the effect of that? Well, for them, it allows them to stabilize what was a dropping GDP and to scrape a lot of inflation out of their economy, as Russia was able to do when it dropped the ruble. You know, it looks like bad news at first when a currency gets gets deflated, but if it's been deflated, that's actually nature taking over. So the deflation actually allows them to increase their exports as well because goods are cheaper coming from China with a lowered currency. It also allows them to position themselves even better for the coming global currency reset. And again, this has been mentioned all the way to the top, even by Christine Lagarde, the head of the IMF, this imminent reset. Okay, so the China has actually referred to this devaluation not as a currency war, but as what they call exchange rate liberalization. It's basically beginning to free up the Chinese economy from U.S. domination. And they've been taking lots of steps in that regard, as have other countries, especially in the BRICS alliance. So it allows the yuan to float more freely against the dollar and to help establish the yuan as a global reserve currency. The Bank of China itself said, quote, "This will allow the markets to have more influence over the yuan exchange rate." In other words, this is what the free market actually is supposed to be doing. But as I mentioned, the U.S. has lots of reasons why they don't want this to happen. A rise in the interest rates of the U.S. would expose U.S. government and banking insolvency, and this would pave the way for the revaluation of the dollar down and other currencies that the U.S. is trying to prevent or at least continue to stall their revaluations. So, mind you, this is not the end of revaluation of the yuan. Chinese economists say their currency has been undervalued against the dollar between 15 and 40% for many years. And it's rumored that China is pushing for at least a 10% overall devaluation of the yuan. Now, the financial expert Peter Schiff, who is well known for having accurately predicted both the 2008 crash and previously the 2001 tech bubble crash. He has been saying very clearly, he said, don't think China is responsible for the crash recently in the U.S. stock market. It has to do with the actions of the Federal Reserve. He says the Chinese economy is far more dynamic and powerful than the U.S. Now, to the rest of us, this should actually be pretty obvious if we look, because of the differing growth rates in each economy and the fact that China is our major creditor, the major creditor really on the planet, and while the U.S. is the biggest debtor in human history. And that's obviously not sustainable in a personal life or ultimately with nation states. Over the summer, China reported that they had accumulated another 600 tons of gold, increasing their supposed holdings to around 1,600 tons. Now, I think that was done very carefully, just enough to indicate that they're ready to play with the big boys in terms of gold reserves, but not enough to panic the world markets. You know, even traditional analysts say that China has been buying gold at least 600 tons a month. 600 tons every 3 months. So the number is probably a lot higher of what they're holding, and many put the estimates, even traditionally, at 10,000 tons or more. Now, to put that in context, the IMF says they hold 90.5 tons. The U.S. says it holds 8,133 tons. And the U.S. has not been honoring requests for repatriation of gold from, back in the 70s with Nixon when he went off the gold standard because we couldn't pay back France. And recently Germany requested their gold back. And They gave them less than 10% and said maybe in 2020 they'd get some more. And the Dragon family had loaned a tremendous amount of gold to the U.S. Over the course of about 40, 50 years, and it was due to be repaid. I've talked about this before, on September 12th, 2001, the day after what happened with the Twin Towers. And don't think that was any coincidence, and a lot of the paperwork for all that was held in the basement of Building 7, the one that came down without being hit by anything. So in addition to all those numbers, I think anyone who has been following the history of the Asian Dragon Alliance probably has a pretty strong sense that these estimates for the holdings of China are ridiculously low. They have been gathering gold from around the world. They've been buying. They have huge veins that they have been mining and supposedly not reporting for centuries. And they have been playing the long game to be in a position of optimal strength when the world goes to an asset-backed financial system. And it looks like that's going to be happening soon, and they will obviously be in a very strong position. Now, when the U.S. has been blaming China for cybersecurity breaches, for devaluing their currency, et cetera, and when they encouraged the IMF to not let the yuan become a global currency, that was a major stirring of the hornet's nest. You know, that was poking the dragon right in the eye. And that's a real, you know, it can be a very humiliating thing for a very proud people who've been working hard on building their economy and taking care of their people. And so retaliation could be expected for that, especially in terms of devaluation of the currency, which has happened, and ultimately a dumping of U.S. treasuries. In other words, beginning to withdraw from buying the loans of the U.S. Treasury. So sure enough, recently China has dumped over $100 billion in U.S. Treasuries in 2 days, and it looks like that's just the beginning. In addition, one more piece of this puzzle is that China has $21 trillion in currency reserve, in sovereign resource reserves, and they are in a position to invest that in the U.S. and other countries, and they're very actively doing that investing all over the world right now. In addition, 19 countries, at least so far, have already switched from dollar to national currencies for energy purposes. So what will happen next? You know, we've laid out various possible scenarios in previous blogs that we've done, but to sum it up very simply, from my perspective, it's either the U.S. is willing to collaborate with the BRICS alliances and the rest of the world and become a partner in a healthy, honest economy globally, or we will be isolated, and it will spell at least short-term catastrophe for the West as the dollar drops. The Dragon family has offered to back the U.S. dollar with its gold. If we don't accept that and the rest of the world goes to asset-backed currencies, it's obviously going to put us in third world status very quickly and isolated from the rest of the world. So it's really it's a paradigm moment. You know, can the status in so-called in charge here be wise and humble enough to actually partner with the rest of the world, or does this macho need to dominate spell catastrophe for the West? Yeah, let's look at the stock markets for a moment. That was the other strong one. When the Chinese stock market dropped, it was portrayed in the U.S. as, see how weak the Chinese economy is, and then when our market dropped, you know, the usual pundits, particularly on mainstream, were very quick to blame China for it. Well, that doesn't kind of jive with reality. What happened in China when their market dropped, you know, approximately 25%, that would be considered a correction in our market. Their stock market had been up 149% in the prior year. So that's a net 125% gain for the last year in their stock market. That's of course not mentioned in the Wall Street Journal. So what did China do about that? They created an alliance of brokerage firms that put close to $20 billion in a fund to buy stocks. They relaxed restrictions on buying, and they created a moratorium on IPOs. Now, do I think that's a great idea? No, those aren't free market activities. But China still has a very dominant, government, and they needed to stem the fall of the economy to keep the confidence of their people, and so they took these actions, and it has at least stalled that correction. But ultimately, as in this country, China and every other country, I think will ultimately need to go to the free market, which is what built the financial strength of the U.S. When it was a more free market, and which also saved the economy of China from the disasters of communism under Mao, which had really essentially destroyed the economy. The BRICS alliance, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, has been clearly creating alternatives to the Rothschild, Rockefeller banking cabal Federal Reserve system, which has been destroying the environment, is destroying economies all over the world. And we were told by a high-ranking member of the Dragon family last spring that in fact the money that most of the money that the Federal Reserve and the IMF and the World Bank were using was borrowed from the Asians against their gold troves. And then the same person told us in the spring that because of the misbehavior, the catastrophes that the Federal Reserve has been creating, and the fact that they haven't been paying back even the interest on those debts, that the Dragon family was going to disenfranchise the Federal Reserve's capability to print money. Now, that was a really big claim last March, I think it was. And a month later, the then Fed Chairman Bernanke announced the end of quantitative easing, which shocked the world and was further confirmation for us that these people that we're talking to from Asia do in fact know a lot about what they're talking about, not just because of their research, but because they're in the thick of this, and they're actually in a very pivotal role. So they have, from what we've been told, and the evidence seems to back it up, they have no interest whatsoever in creating World War III. So they have been creating the alternatives. They've been inviting the U.S. into a good deal, a soft landing, and meanwhile creating an alternative gold exchange and the alternative, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the Asian Development Bank. And other countries are invited into this, and many of them are joining, but the U.S. has stayed away. But meanwhile, they've also been creating an alternative internet, and we were told that they have created an alternative, what they call a SWIFT system, which is International Electronic Transfer for Funds, which is now used all over the globe, and it's run and controlled in a very manipulative ways by the Federal Reserve. So, of course, it's been difficult for the Asian elders to move significant funds for humanitarian purposes because it had to be moved through the Federal Reserve SWIFT system, and it has been stalled, it's been stolen along the way. So they stopped trying to do that until there's an alternative system in place or until the U.S. is willing to allow a free flow of funds. And so we were told that was publicly. I saw articles saying, well, in September or October, that will be released at the end of 2015 at the earliest. And what we were told by the Dragon family was it was actually finished in the spring and is gradually starting to be used. So, this is a major shift in power over the economy globally. Now, I found a couple of quotes that were at least good news. I don't know whether to for sure believe them or not, but it's what I want to hear. First of all, because we have to ask ourselves the question, if China is going to be in this powerful a position in the world, if they hold most of the world's wealth and they're, such a significant leader in the BRICS alliance and the Western empire is falling, well, are we just going to go into the next new global regime, under the thumb of China? And, I think we need to be very wary about that. But I found an article where they interviewed this man named Professor General Liu Mingfu, and he declared that there are no imperialist intentions. He said China has been invaded 470 times between 1840 and 1905. And the people there know that doesn't feel good. It ultimately doesn't work. It destroys cultures, it destroys human lives, and certainly destroys stability. President Xi Jinping recently said, China is not trying to rearrange the architecture of global governance. Instead, he said that should be decided by all countries. So I'm not going to get into the whole notion of global governance, but at least having all countries participate in the conversation and being free and sovereign is a major step toward individual sovereignty across the world.